Hello, beautiful, and welcome to the Moms Talks Sex podcast. I'm your host, Maura Yelvington of Morph Transform Your Reality, where I help women step out of trauma and reclaim their power. I'm so happy to have you here for this open conversation about moms, sex, motherhood, children, relationships, marriage, and everything in between. So grab your drink of choice and let's dive in. I'm so honored to have the beautiful Christina here with me today. Hi, Christina.
Hi, how are you?
I'm doing great, and I'm so excited for this conversation. I feel like it's going to shed so much light for so many of our moms listening. So, how about you introduce yourself and let us and tell us a little bit what you do and how you got to where you're at right now.
Okay. My name is Christina Trujillo Sieren, and so I'm a licensed psychotherapist, and I'm also the owner and lead coach at Unapparent Parenting, which is a coaching program for parents of teens. So I'm helping parents shift away from an input-output idea of what it means to parent and really help them redefine parenting from the inside out. So really helping parents get back into their own center and really focus on what their parenting priorities are and what their values are, and then helping that flow out into their parenting dynamic. So Unapparent Parenting started, it's about a little bit over a year old now. And it kind of just fell on my lap a little bit. I never thought that I would necessarily gear the structure of my business towards parenting, but it all started kind of just aligning in these really unique ways. And I kind of ran with it, and here I am. I don't really know if there wasn't like one big cumulative kind of thing that happened to get me here.
So what is unapparent parenting? What is that about?
So unapparent parenting is really shifting away from a mainstream idea of what it means to parent. So a lot of times I get parents coming in and they are like, hey, Christina, I really want to help my child do X, Y, and Z. And it's really coming from a place of how do I fix my child is really essentially, I think, that bigger umbrella idea. And what we're trying to do at Unapparent Parenting is how can we take an intervention or a tool and really understand it more so from the perspective of, does it align and fit with who I am? Does it fit into, the personality of my child? Does it really match to my personality? Does this really fit with my idea of community, if that's a huge value for you? Does this really fit into my partnership or my marriage? So we're really allowing parents to redefine parenting from them first and then flow that into the child. So we're looking not only at the dynamic between parent and child, but I also want to know, what does your business look like? What does your work look like? What does your romantic partnership look like? What do you want to do for fun? Where do you find time for yourself? And then also, what does that look like for your parenting? So we're looking at all these different dynamics versus just a narrow scope on parenting itself in a very traditional sense.
I love that. I think this is a really important topic because so much of what happens with our kids a lot of times trickles to the bedroom, right? If we don't agree
Absolutely.
about how we educate, if we don't agree, or if we see things differently, it can cause a lot of frictions in the marriage, in the intimacy, and can end up in some cases even in divorce. So what are some tools that our listeners can do to start identifying, these parenting modalities to help them stay happy and together, because one of the biggest things that's really heartbreaking to me is when you see two parents kind of survive parenting and they get to 18 and then the divorce because they're completely disconnected. They're completely in different places of their life and the intimacy just completely breaks apart. So how can we maybe prevent that?
I think one of the biggest things that I always talk about is the permission to get back to self. So I know for myself personally, when I had kids, I felt like I had to immerse all of my energy and time into my children. They were coming first. I sorry, I have to drop all this and do X, Y, and Z for them. And that really lends itself, I think, to move away from a foundation of a strong marriage and a healthy dynamic within a romantic partnership. And so I think, first of all, it's the permission to say, you have needs too as a parent. And your needs are going to flow into different categories. It's going to be romantic. It's going to be my personal needs. What do I need to kind of feel, I think good and healthy, and I think even sexy or intimate. And then what do my children need? And I think that first part is, what do I need and what's important to me? if I could really create this beautiful blueprint from like this ideal kind of idea of what I want, it would be, what do I want my romantic partnership to look like? What do I want my marriage to look like? Do I want to have, I want to have date nights every so often. I want to make sure that like our intimate life behind the scenes is really like explorative and exciting. What does your career look like? I want it to look like this. And this is my ideal of what I want to see. What about your parenting? And I think once we start to break down each category of what we want, it's much easier to look at our resources and our demands, where we kind of maybe need to cut back and maybe set some boundaries, but also where we have to maybe implement some extra stuff. So if we're saying, hey, I really want to make sure we have date night every single week, and this is a priority and it's going to be on Thursday, but we don't really necessarily maybe have a support system, maybe part of that resource that we need is to look for somebody who can come in every single week and be that place for the kids to be. Or maybe we get creative and our kids are in an activity and we're like, hey, they're both occupied for an hour and a half. Let's go grab coffee and really just reconnect. Or let's see if we can have another parent bring them home. That gives us an extra window and we can go do X, Y, and Z.
I love that. And what about situations where both parents feel very differently about how to approach a situation with a child, right? I feel like a lot of that can be explosive in the bedroom, not in a good way.
Right, exactly. I think it's a fallacy to believe that I think our parenting and the way that we parent isn't going to affect our romantic relationship. It's just what's going to happen, right? So I think a lot of it is going back to, I think, the premise of communication, but also really breaking down what your values are and what your priorities are, because we do have different values when we come into a parenting dynamic, right? I tell clients all the time, the way that you were raised, the way, you're taking in all this information of what you liked, what you didn't like. Do I want to provide this for my children? Absolutely not. Or I want to do this differently because it didn't work for me. So you have essentially two people coming into a relationship with their own stuff of how they want to parent. And I think a lot of times we forget how important it is to have those conversations, and not as a like I'm right, you're wrong, or mine is good, yours is bad, but more so a perspective taking and a perspective shift. So we really know where the other person is coming from. And when we're able to talk about those values and priorities, I think we have a better sense of what our partner wants and needs versus just making this assumption that we're, ramming heads in the worst way possible. And then we're fighting over how to parent our children, and I think once we have like, if someone's like, I really want like our kids to have adventures and activities, and that's the value that I want right now in this moment, that's going to look vastly different than someone who's like, I really want to make sure that our kids are really empathetic and whatnot. Those are going to still overlap in some way, but the way that we approach and take action is going to look very different.
Yeah. So what would that look like really? Or what would you suggest to couples that bring this kind of dynamic to you?
So I would say like step one is I would sit down, I think even just on a personal level before coming together and sitting down and really being honest with yourself about what you want your parenting to look like, or what values are you trying to instill in this moment? Because those can also shift over time with developmental periods, depending on what age your kid is at. And then I would say have those come together and then have a conversation of, how do you want to put this into practice? So if you have the value of respect, what does that look like? What's the expectation, between you and your child? Like, but also, how do you want your partner to support that? Because I think that's the bigger piece, is ultimately we're like, well, we want to do it this way. It might be a shift for the other partner to come in and do it in that way. But I think if we're able to really communicate why it's so important to us, I think it's much easier for our partner to come on board and be like, I've got your back. I'm here to support you. I don't necessarily know I understand it because the way that I was raised was different, or, my priorities really over here. But I think when we start to really be honest, like really vulnerable and honest in that way of how we communicate, in that emotional way, that is definitely going to translate over to the intimacy that happens, in the bedroom, and the way that we're connecting, because it's all just pouring out, I think, in a ripple effect sort of way.
Yeah, I love that. So really what I'm hearing from you is the best way to parent our kids is to model it our own.
Yeah,
right?
I think
So
it's definitely the
model.
modeling, and the communication with our partner.
Yeah, I love that. That is really powerful. So is there any tips that you can give our listeners, like if they're dealing with a situation right now in their house that's maybe a little bit, a disagreement? Is there something that they can do to diffuse the situation?
Well, I always say step one is to go from bottom to top. So I think whenever we're in a place where things are really tense or there's a lot of conflict for whatever reason, I think step one is like really taking that space for ourselves so we can recenter and regroup and really get in a place of what I call curious observation. Like, what's happening for me? Like, how is my body responding to this? What is the most loving thing I can do for myself right now? What is it that I need right now in this moment? What do I need moving forward? And I think once you have like step one of that grounded energy, I called it, whatever your peace or your calm or the kind of like feeling like you're back in that power and you have a little bit more control, then I would say then it's really important to then come back to the communication piece, with your partner and really share where you're at. Again, it's really about sharing perspective, because I think a lot of times we come into any type of relationship and we have an expectation that the other person's just going to agree with us. And so, but I also perspective taking doesn't necessarily mean agreement. So we can be on different sides of the issue or really kind of have different perspectives and still be able to come together and realign in a way that feels really connecting and supportive to our relationship. And I think also too, I think there's also that permission piece. Sometimes there's going to be conversations or tensions that are going to be longer standing ones. Right. There might be issues that we fight about that just tend to be ones that kind of like hit that really like sore spot for us, or maybe it's that trigger point, so to speak, or kind of feels like we're putting salt on the wound. So I think the more that we kind of just like allow ourselves to be in that practice of communicating makes it a little bit easier to navigate, the next time it pops up, if it's an ongoing kind of issue that kind of just pops up in the marriage.
Yeah, I always talk about subconscious beliefs that come up. And so many times we're just not aware that these buttons are there and they're activated. And what really helps for me is when I'm aware that I'm being triggered, I take a step back, because that's how I know that I could potentially explode. So going back to who I am, going into my body, taking, retracting to my bedroom, just like I need a minute, right? Counting to 10, breathing, allowing myself to come back and not to react from that hurt place has really helped me shift it with my children. So that's just a little quick tip. Well, thank you so much for this conversation, because I feel like it's very eye-opening and it's really retracting back to us and looking at, how we react, how we act, how we communicate, and shifting that and then modeling that for our children. So I think that's very powerful and a different way of looking at things, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I always say that I think it's really important to get different perspectives and really, we all can look to other people for their expertise, but we're really our own expert on what makes sense for us, which is why I love kind of just sharing tidbits and kind of allowing people to say like, hey, this fits for me, or like, hey, like this part, but not necessarily this part. Because I think we all really have to realign and really get back to our place of what makes sense for us. So.
Yeah, I love it. So if our listeners want to find you, where can they find you?
So they can find me on Facebook or Instagram under Unapparent Parenting if you just search up those words. And then you can find me at unapparentparenting.com or christinasieren.com. They'll go back to the same place. But yeah, or they can join my newsletter and get some tidbits that come out here and there throughout the year.
Oh, I love it. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for being here and for this awesome conversation. I really appreciate you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for listening to today's episode. If this was a contribution to you, please share, like, love, and comment. I would love to hear from you more, and make sure to follow us on Morph Healing. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and remember, you are here for a reason. I see you. Love, more.